Hi, this is the CAA number 3, the historical timeline. I'm Addie.
I'm Hallee.
And I'm Jenna. Let's get into it. Okay, so the first case is Brown versus Board of Education, and it happened in 1954. And what happened is that the Supreme Court ruled under the 14th Amendment that it was unlawful to discriminate against any group of people, as in separate people because of their race in schools. So it got rid of the separate but equal doctrine, and it caused integration into the education system. And so some implications for this when it comes to ELLs is that it doesn't matter what your native language is, you still deserve the right to education. And implications for special education is that it laid the groundwork for future special education cases because parents argue that every child has the civil right to education and therefore they should not be not allowed to be in schools. And some limitations that there weren't many bilingual teachers that were qualified. Most teachers obviously spoke English. And for special education, the school district still had the right to choose whether or not to participate in special education incentives. So they could say that they didn't want to have special education classes.
Okay, so this one is the Title VII Bilingual Education Act, which happened in 1968. And it was just pretty much a law to help students with limited English skills. And it didn't originally require schools to use a language other than English to require funding. So this was kind of like the start of where other languages were required. And the targeted people that it was for was aimed at children who were poor and unable to speak English, and it kind of sparked the bilingual movement. And each reauthorization of this act had an increased funding for schools, so it was kind of like a continuous act that helped fund schools. And some of the implications was that it helped to focus on English fluency, and it increased dual language programs. And then some of the limitations were that it wasn't for every non-English speaking language, but it was only aided in Spanish speaking children, and it was a very competitive program.
The Section 504 of the Vocational Rehabilitation Act of 1973 protected individuals that receive federal funds. So that's whether it's you're in schools or in a different program that receives federal funding, you will be protected by this act. And it also provides students with the opportunity to participate in a full range of school activities. So through this, students with under Section 504 are able to receive accommodations, not just in the classroom, but throughout the day to participate to the best of their abilities and in accordance with their accommodations throughout the entire school day. And that goes with the implications that that they're able to be provided with accommodations throughout the day, whether that be accommodations of interpreters, and with the special education, it is because they're in public schools under public funding. The limitations of this can be that it only applies to students who have disabilities that impacts their day-to-day life.
All right, so the case Law versus Nichols in 1974 ruled that a California school district that was receiving federal funding for education must provide non-English speaking students with supplemental instruction so that they're able to receive equal education. So basically ELLs were allowed to go to school. They were just taught primarily in English and it wasn't doing them any good. So this case affirmed that all students were entitled to an opportunity to participate even when they are not fluent in English. And some implications for English language learners was that it aimed to help them develop their English proficiency by providing them with supplemental materials. And failure to provide this violates the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act because they are not receiving equal education, no matter the native language. And some limitations is that the ruling was somewhat broad and there were no specified steps for how the school could help ELLs It didn't tell the schools like how much they had to do, what they needed to do, and it was left up to discretion. So that was a very big limitation for this case.
Okay, so for this case, it's the Castaneda versus Picard of 1981. And it came after the Lau versus Nichols, and it kind of brought about doubts about it, like Addie was just talking about. And the court relied on the EEOA to mandate help for the English learners. And the Congress was affirming that educational neglect violated civil rights. So like this very fact that people were being neglected for their language like violates what is a civil right. And so people just having like good faith effort didn't discharge officials and responsibilities. So it needed to have an actual action and not just like a good heart behind it. And so the standard was sound educational theory implemented effectively, and it was effective in overcoming language handicaps. And so some of the implications was that this standard helped to ensure that local school districts were meeting their obligations to actually efficiently help students. And it helped determine the adequacy of programs for ELL students. And then some of the limitations was that it didn't always ensure like a quality educational program, and a lot of students were harmed before from inadequate programs were discovered. So like a lot of students had to go through the hard before actually having an efficient and an adequate program to help their education.
The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 was originally was the original act, and then it was amended again in 2008, and it protects all individuals with disabilities from discrimination, whether that be in school or the workplace. It also gives persons with disabilities access to resources to be able to use any public space or transportation. So for special education, this act protects students with disabilities from discrimination and gives them access to the necessary resources they need to succeed. But it only prevents against discrimination that happens in accordance with a disability, so it does not protect them otherwise. And Doe versus Withers happened in 1993 when a high school teacher chose to fail a student who had a low learning disability. And the Virginia Circuit Court ruled that Mr. Withers was at fault and in the wrong for failing to accommodate the student. As mentioned previously, he did not keep the good faithful accommodations and failed to see the needs of the student, which negatively impacted the student's success. So this impacted special education because it determined that any student was entitled to accommodations and is unlawful to go against that. The limitations of this can be that these are circumstances of this case do not specify the limitations on accommodations, specifically what is defined as too little accommodations.
Okay. Oh, this one right? Okay. Proposition 227 from 1998 was an initiative called English for Children, and it required California public schools to teach LEP students in special classes that are taught nearly all in English. And it claimed that bilingual education was a violation of immigrant children's right to learn English. And then this proposition, or this was repealed by Proposition 58 in 2017. So I think that it was kind of taking the approach of that it would be more effective for students to be fully immersed in English when that was not an effective way of teaching students. So it was repealed in 2017. But some of the implications was that it was in place in schools in California, Arizona, and Massachusetts. And it was continuing bilingual programs due to the effectiveness and need. And then the limitations were that this provision had the effect of eliminating bilingual classes in most cases. And then it also shortened the time that most LEP students got to stay in special education classes.
Okay, so the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 was applied to all kindergarten through 12th grade graders in public schools in the United States. And basically the goal was to keep all schools accountable for how their students learn. And the goal was to provide more opportunities for four groups, and that was students of color, students in poverty, students receiving special education services, and English language learners. And to keep the schools accountable for how they taught, the government used annual testing, targets and goals, and they even penalized schools for not reaching these goals or helping these students. And so the implications was that it put a greater focus on struggling students who really needed help, and it pushed the schools to give them more opportunities. And the same thing goes for special education. It pushed schools to give them more opportunities and just to help them in more ways because they have more needs. But some limitations was that the annual standardized testing was biased against those who grew up outside of the US or who didn't speak a lot of English. So if they were in ELL taking an annual standardized testing, they would fall behind, and that would also cause the schools to be penalized because the tests were biased. And for special education, a limitation was that the standards-based accountability of the No Child Left Behind Act was really inconsistent with the needs of special education, because when it comes to special education, it really focuses on a specific student's strengths and needs and not just everything they need to know being tested. And so that leads to the Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015. And this initially replaced the ESSA. And it again affected all students in public schools. The main goal was also to make sure that schools provide quality education for every student. And it was still holding schools accountable, but it phrased it in a way that it wanted each school to have a plan that describes academic standards, annual testing, goals for achievement, and plans for supporting struggling schools and school accountability. And its goal was also to help students of different race, students who have special education, ELLs, and students in poverty. And so some implications was that it again encouraged states to meet students where they are, and the Every Student Succeeds Act encouraged schools to help students learn at their own pace. And this really helps students who are ELLs because they weren't forced to learn at the same rate as everyone else who had an advantage of knowing English. And they also provided a lot of literacy education grants to the state so that schools could use that money for literacy-based instruction. And for special education, this supported an approach that let students have many different ways to learn instead of just one. And some limitations is that ESSA doesn't yes. For special education, annual testing it still didn't differentiate for students with special needs. And here is our references slide. And that is it. Thank you.
Thank you.